advise that department and our administration in that department. I represent the district in litigation related to special education services. And I also oversee the department's compliance efforts with special education laws and regulations. So the conversation today is right up my alley in terms of a lot of the work that I do on a regular basis. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for being here. So jumping in to set a little bit of framework when we're talking about disproportionality in special education, I think most of you are aware that in late 2016, there was a new regulation issued that required states and districts to break down their rates of identification, placement in restrictive settings, and discipline by race and ethnicity. And then really look and analyze that data to see if any groups of students are overrepresented or underrepresented, which would be significant disproportionality. The Trump administration delayed implementation of that regulation until a court said that they needed to stop delaying and go ahead and move forward. And while there's been a lot of focus on this new regulation, and it is significant because there's money attached to it. Districts that are cited can have to spend 15% of their IDEA funds on comprehensive coordinated early intervening services to try to address that disproportionality. But there were previously other parts of IDEA and the regulations that already required states to be looking at some of this information related to identification and discipline specifically. And so I think most of you guys are familiar with the ISB indicators and the different data that is collected and that they look at. But Jeremy, maybe it would be helpful for you to give us a little overview of those indicators, especially related to disproportionality that we're going to be discussing.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So as you all probably know, there are 14 indicators that ISB is generally looking at in terms of monitoring compliance around special education. They range pretty significantly, as I'm sure you're aware, from everything from issues related to early childhood education to issues of transition and the focus for today, which is disproportionality. And so I wanted to take just a moment to try to frame the conversation today, because we will be focusing in on a few of those indicators and not all 14. That would be a lot for one conversation. And so as we talk today, we're really going to focus in on, it's 3 indicators, but it breaks down into 4 different areas. So indicator 4 is actually broken down into 2 areas. The first being indicator 4A, which focuses on a significant discrepancy in the rate of suspensions and expulsions of greater than 10 days for children with IEPs. And then the second part of indicator 4 is indicator 4B, and that looks at discrepancies by race and ethnicity in the rate of suspensions and expulsion, again, greater than 10 days of children with IEPs. And then it also has a focus in looking at policies, procedures, and practices that contribute to that significant discrepancy. So that indicator 4, as I mentioned, has those 2 components, and it's broken down in those 2 ways. The other 2 indicators, indicator 9 is focused on disproportionate representation of racial and ethnic groups in special education and related services as it relates to inappropriate identification for those services. And then indicator 10 looks at disproportionate representation for racial and ethnic groups in specific disability categories as a result of inappropriate identification. So those are the 4 factors that we're going to really be focusing on today, and will help kind of frame our conversation as we go along.
Danny, did you have anything else that you wanted to add on these? Thank you, Jeremy. That's super helpful to set us up.
I don't think so. I mean, the only thing to add would be, ISB uses a lot of different terms and definitions around disproportionality. And sometimes that can be a little bit confusing and complicated. Even Kendra and I were talking about some of the differences that are very subtle. But specifically in the indicators 4A and 4B, that's what we receive on the end of the school, or at the end of the year when we're submitting our data in iStar. And they use a risk ratio of 3.0 for those indicators. They look at something that's called significant discrepancy on indicators 4A and 4B, which is a slightly different formula. And then they talk about significant disproportionality which is what you can be cited at looking at over a 3-year span, and they use a 4.0 risk ratio. And so it's just important to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at your data that you may not actually qualify, even though you may be starting to have some emerging issues to consider.
Great, thank you. So I understand that ISB may flag or will flag when a district has disproportionate representation in a given area for 3 consecutive years. Is there anything in each of your experiences that has been flagged that has surprised you? And are you calculating your own, district's risk ratios to know if there are areas of concern before ISB cites a problem? We'll be curious to hear your thoughts on this. I don't know, Jenny, if you want to share first.
Yes, so Lake Forest High School has not been cited on either any of the indicators. And although we don't specifically calculate our own risk ratios, we know we are not approaching the 3.0 or the 4.0 risk ratio level. Every year we do meet and analyze our data. When we submit our data to an ISTAR, of course, we verify our data, and at that point, we begin to look at trends. We also share the data with our administrative team and identify strengths, as well as any patterns that might require more careful attention or analysis. We also partner with NSSED, our cooperative, and part of our fall planning and our mid-year review with them, we also review this data and looking at potential partnerships or supports that we could receive from the cooperative to help us if there are any trends or patterns identified. And so that's what our process looks like at Lake Forest High School.
Great, thanks. Cheryl, what about you?
So we haven't specifically calculated our own risk ratios. We were looking at some of the other indicators that we had been cited on. 5A, especially with those students in the different educational environments, which really lent itself to us looking at these other areas of indicator 9 and 10, which we also need to address for compliance. So really, we ended up taking a deep dive into that information to see if we could identify what the root causes were. And so we do have a disproportionality of African American students who are in special education for indicator 9, as well as those students that have been identified disproportionately in certain disability areas. So with looking at that, we really looked at what do we need to do differently in regards to behavior, social emotional learning, as well as what do we need to do with the MTSS process in regards to academic rigor for those students to assist in changing outcomes for those students. So some of the things that we've done is we've looked at the reduction of self-contained environments in our school district. We've also looked at working with safe and civil schools to be able to provide our own behavior program here. So that too would prevent students from being outplaced, but we would have a 3-tier system within the district so that we can support students. And also so that as we are kid watchers and data watchers, really looking at other areas to prevent issues from happening. So we are now working through the process of correcting those compliance issues.
Great, thanks for sharing. Jeremy, did you have anything to add?
I did, just one quick point. And I think this is not necessarily specific to Waukegan. I think this is just a larger point in general. But I was certainly hopeful, as someone who's been practicing in this area for a while, that when the law changed around student discipline with SB 100 back in 2016, I believe, I was hopeful that we would see some changes in terms of these rates overall because of the stringent requirements of SB 100. I know, as it relates to student discipline, I know that schools are still struggling with this, and there are a lot of issues that go into that. But it's certainly something that I think in general kind of gave me pause and was a little bit surprising that maybe we weren't a little bit further ahead, especially given that change in the law. So that's the one thing that I will say that somewhat surprises me.
It's a really good point and a good promo for our webinar next month, which will be about discipline issues. And so we'll definitely want to dive into those as well. We've had a lot of conversations about that and, trying to move away from exclusionary discipline generally, and how that would impact all of these issues. Before we dive into talking a little bit more about all of the initiatives that you guys have done in each of your districts to try to prevent or address disproportionalities that may exist or be emerging, Jenny, I know you actually did your dissertation on this topic. And so I was hoping you could kind of walk us through a little bit about what does the research say on these issues, and what did you find in your research to share with us and give us some additional information here. And I will try. You gave me beautiful slides, and let me see if I can share them. There we go. Is that working?
Perfect.
Good.
Thank you, Kendra. Well, it's exciting to talk about my dissertation, which I completed in 2018. So you'll have to bear with me a little bit, but the title of the study was Critical Conversations with Administrative Leaders on Special Education Disproportionality. So as a case study approach with 3 suburban high schools in the central or north part of the state. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this qualitative study and that really looked at many of the challenges that we face in schools, and the administrators that participated, there were 9 in total, were really helpful in my learning as well as the learning of this topic. So thank you. So Kendra, you could go to the next one. The next 2 slides really highlight 3 major research studies that are out there that are qualitative in nature, that examine administrators and educators' beliefs and perceptions about the role of why disproportionality exists in schools. And none of these studies specifically only looked at administrators' viewpoints. They included teachers, parents, related service providers, and various educators. And so my study specifically focused on administrators, but these, there's 3 studies, the one by Skiba, 2006, Hardin 2009, and Ball. I'm going to talk about them more when I talk about the findings of my study, but this can also serve as a resource for you if you later want to go back and look at these studies, because they were very interesting and collecting information and some of the practices in order to change disproportionality. And so you can go to the summary of research findings. Specifically, my research study looked at 3 questions. And the first question was, why does racial disproportionality exist in your school district? The second question was, what beliefs and practices contribute to racial disproportionality? And then the last question is, what can we do? What practices or interventions need to be implemented in order to reduce it or eventually eliminate it in your school district? And so in looking at, the findings, we used a coding process to really, after administrators participated in a series of interview questions as well as surveys, we coded all of the data. And there are 3 major themes that emerged why racial disproportionality existed in their school districts. And there was a lot of commonalities, and so I really highlight them here. And I even provide you some of the exact quotes. But administrative leaders' responses were really consistent with the findings in the research as well, which is that oftentimes there's a relationship cited regarding poverty and school readiness. So 7 of the 9 administrators who participated in the study described family values, community factors, and or poverty as major reasons why disproportionality exists, which is actually very congruent with like a deficit model. And so one of the things that we'll talk about later in looking at the interventions is really making sure that we're addressing that deficit view, which is well established in the research, which includes blaming others, including families and students, for their problems at school, instead of really looking at what can we do differently in school to engage or partner with families and students. And so it's important that we figure out as administrators how to provide that training and that support to guard against the deficit view of thinking. And so that was one of the major themes that emerged. A second major theme that emerged is similar to what we were talking about with the different indicators, is that high schools, because my study specifically focused on high schools, all have different methods for gathering, reviewing, and analyzing their data, which sometimes can result in data admiration, unconscious biases, or even color blindness. And these are some of the things that the administrators talked about in detail in my study. 3 of them openly talked about how their school district was doing very little to address racial disproportionality, even though they knew it existed. Oftentimes that was due to a change in leadership or not having the appropriate resources in place, or some of the funding that Kendra mentioned. Also, some took the colorblind perspective and just said, they didn't think it existed in their school, but in looking at some of their school report cards, although they might not have been cited for 3 years of having racial disproportionality, there was definitely a higher incidence of students, either placed in restrictive placements or a higher EE code compared to their peers. And so those are definitely areas to consider. And then lastly, they also talked about unconscious bias and how sometimes there's biases or things that are automatically ingrained in their school systems. Their traditions, they've done these things a certain way for a long time, or policies have existed that sort of continues to result in creating these disproportionate practices that really need to be addressed or looked at. And then Kendra, you could go to the next slide. And then the last theme that emerged, why does it exist, is that one of the things they talked about is that students of color exhibit more academic and behavioral skill deficits requiring more supports than they felt like they could provide in their schools. Again, this is very much related to blaming others, and as well as not necessarily having the appropriate supports or training in schools for teachers. And so it's one administrator was very honest and said, we work very hard to reflect upon our practices. We've tried to be objective as possible, but we struggle because they're coming through with pre-existing skill deficits that are hard to address in the high school classroom. And so really thinking differently about your tier 1 and tier 2 supports is something we're going to talk about a little bit later in the interventions. And I think out of good faith, everyone wants to help students. And so special education is often seen as the answer because they weren't sure what else to do. They don't want these students to struggle. Everyone wants them to get their needs met. They want them to have the appropriate supports, but they felt like special ed was the answer in order to get that. And so those are the 3 major reasons that were cited for racial disproportionality in schools. And then, so the second research question talked about the beliefs, which are really congruent with oftentimes, the reasons why, or so the practices that contribute. And so I sort of just mentioned a little bit about the lack of tier 1 interventions was something that was very much cited, as well as culturally relevant curriculum and understanding how to reduce racial disproportionality. All administrators spoke of that needed to be a key central factor moving forward. As I just previously said, oftentimes special education was seen as the magic bullet, especially for students with significant social emotional needs. One thing that really came out though, in talking about this question is although students and families were sometimes, mentioned to be blamed, they really recognized and talked openly about what schools need to do differently and really put that onus on schools and moving more to a practical strategy approach of making sure all students are included and teachers have the skills and the strategies they need to meet diverse learning needs. And as Jeremy said, despite some of the practices as well as increased restorative justice practices, students of color are still more likely to be suspended across Illinois and all the states. And so we definitely still have work to do. And I think that that's where this third factor of an implicit bias and unconscious bias still continues to be play a central role. And that was what administrators identified as some of the practices that they're still seeing in their school districts. And then the final question was what interventions and practices need to be implemented? And this is definitely my favorite part, and what I'm passionate about is really making sure that we're not leaving any student behind, that we're doing everything that we can, and that we're constantly learning and collaborating and teaming with all members to build a system to systematically help all students. It should be proactive, it should be universal, and it needs to be led by strong leadership. And so we really need to start in Tier 1. And we need to develop a systematic plan that teachers feel comfortable. And this is very similar to the BAL study that I talked about from 2014. And so they initially began looking at, okay, what practices can we change? And they quickly saw that that doesn't work. That's a very technical solution to disproportionality, that we really need to engage all stakeholders and really examining our practices and begin to think differently about how we're going to support all students, which is also what many of the administrators in this study cited as well. They also cited that they needed more support and leadership, not only from the district office, but from their Board of Education, and a commitment to actually providing the resources and the training that they need in order to blow up tracking or destroying racial predictability in their schools. And lastly, they talked about, just making staff aware of the disparities and looking them is not enough, and that we really need to have a strategic plan or a system in place in order to ensure that we are working to eliminate this day by day until we are there. And one of the things I found in my study was this guidebook by Osher. That's called Addressing the Root Causes of Disparities in School Disciplines. And it really helps walk through like the steps that districts can take in building a collaborative process to begin to examine data and develop an action plan that can truly make a difference that's sustainable in improving outcomes for all students. And so that's really the quick overview. And I know it was a lot of information, but it was definitely an interesting study.
Jenny, thank you so much for sharing all of that. The work that you did to pull all of that together and digest it all is impressive. And so thank you for doing your best to summarize it in the amount of time that we have today so succinctly. So let's now turn, especially, with that backdrop, let's turn to the work that each of you are doing in your districts to talk through, what potential causes have you identified to some of the areas that have been revealed in your data, and how are you addressing them? So obviously that's a very big question. So perhaps let's break it down into chunks and talk about identification and placement and discipline separately. So, first, for identification of students with disabilities for special education services, what potential causes have you identified, and potential steps that you are considering taking to address that? Cheryl, do you want to start? Cheryl, we can't hear you.
I apologize. We are a fairly new department here in Waukegan. The other assistant director came in January of 2019, but he had also been in the district for about 2.5 years before that. Our director came in July 2019, and I came in January of 2019. So it really has been a discovery process for us in regards to looking at the data and attempting to identify the root causes. We do know that we need to look at areas that focus on equity, also that focus on culturally responsive practices. We also want to look at restorative justice and academic rigor, and really looking at focusing on what our children can do. Our district is also looking at standards-based grading across the board. And so we know with standards-based grading, then we're talking about some different assessment systems also, so that we're able to identify some of those strengths that students have, and being able to have students be able to demonstrate their mastery in different ways. So I think that that also impacts some of what Jenny said, just in those mindsets and those belief systems, you know, when we're talking about racial disparities, that we need to understand that all children have the capacity for high levels of learning, but we need to definitely create the environment for that to occur for students. And those big pieces are really building those relationships, getting to know your students, and moving from there, learning their learning styles, learning their interests, and moving from there. So some of the things that we are doing in our district is we are at the special ed department, or the diverse learner department, and our psychologists at MTSS teams are working very closely together to build a strong and robust tier 1 and tier 2 support across the district for all students, because we believe that that is a way to definitely provide early intervention for students. We also have 2 programs that are in Becoming a Man. We also have a women program very similar to that, where we're focusing on really supporting students in the decision-making process. We also have the Asian Human Services that comes in and provides services. We've increased our FTEs in our counseling department, as well as our social work department. We've hired 4 behavior specialists. So those specialists work with the schools to definitely create plans for students, so that when we identify students at that tier 1 level, that we're really all in there doing as much as we can to hopefully turn things around for students. We've also developed something that we call the Waukegan After-Hour Intervention and Support Program at home. So it's kind of like almost like a life coaching, parent education, but definitely stepping in the gaps for some of our families that have been hard to reach, or after hours aren't able to come to school for certain things. So we have some interventionists that work with them. And we also have developed an equity department that is staffed. So really, again, really trying to look at how can we make sure that we are supporting all students. We also work with Safe and Civil Schools, as I said earlier. We are also doing some IEP training, right? Because we know that a lot of times it's those goals that we're writing. If we really want to move students in a particular direction, then we need to write those focus goals for that. Lots of looking at differentiated instruction. We're doing some co-teaching training with our staff. We're also bringing in some other interventions that we're going to be utilized. And as I stated before, the standards-based grading is going to impact those standards-based IEPs, so that we feel that that is really going to help us in supporting our students in that academic sense, because the better a student feels about themselves academically, the more buy-in they have to school, which can also impact behavior. And also just listening to Jenny, I really thought about collective teacher efficacy, right? That's a very big piece, that we have to believe that we have what it takes to support our students and to move them where we want to move them. So that's definitely some of the things that we're doing, is just really providing the supports for our staff and trying to move in the direction that we want to move in, to open minds and to have those beliefs and to really support those people. Because I know Jenny had stated that sometimes people are not feeling that the administration, or maybe even central office or the school board are supporting. And I believe that we are a district where we are getting that support at every level. And together we can move where we want to move and have our children succeed.
That's great, thank you. Such a large amount of comprehensive approaches that you're taking there. Jenny, what about you in terms of your district and with identification?
Thank you, Cheryl, too, for sharing all the great stuff that you guys are doing at Waukegan. There's a lot of really great things happening at Lake Forest as well. And, the biggest thing that stood out to me when I started here 5 years ago initially was we really had a high number of students eligible for special education. And I think that kind of goes back to that magic bullet I was talking about before. We had over 18% of our student population qualified and receiving services, which was much higher than the state average, as well as all the other high schools in this area. And so we really needed to examine our procedures, including our MTSS supports and how we're supporting our students who are struggling. And, one thing that's a little bit unique about Lake Forest High School is that 90% of our students are meeting or exceeding state standards in reading and math. And so when a student is performing average or even slightly below average, their need appears to be far discrepant from their peers than would a typical student who may be struggling. And that really resulted in increased referrals for special education. Additionally, we really lacked those informal and formal tier 1 and tier 2 systems. And our principal was a cheerleader and a champion for making sure it didn't matter if we had 1 student or 100 students, every student needed to get what they needed. And so we began partnering with our school psychs and our reading specialists and math departments to build some of those tiered supports. And so we now have a whole wide variety of universal tier 1 supports. We also have embedded tier 2 for reading and math support, executive functioning, peer tutoring program. Similar to Waukegan, the special education department specifically has provided intensive training on IEP development, including goals and making sure that services that are aligned to those goals. We moved to the IEP facilitation model, which is a much more strengths-based approach. So instead of such a deficit-based approach of like what students can't do, how can we really utilize their strengths to develop an action plan that's going to help them learn and grow. And that really changed the trajectory of conversations for families, teachers, and the entire team member. It feels like a lot more hopeful and positive, really getting away from that deficit view that I think is cited a lot in the research. We also have provided intensive professional development on UDL and differentiation and inclusive practices. And so that's really helped people be able to learn more, share their values, and increase their comfort level around meeting the needs of all of our learners. The biggest changes that we've made in the last 2 years in order to reduce the number of students eligible for special education too is we've also, we're providing instructional coaching at the freshman level. So we're heterogeneously grouping in science and social studies. And so teachers feel like they have the resources now and the supports to be able to meet all of the students' needs. We have natural proportions in all of our general education classes. And then we do a hand scheduling process where we actually match the resources then to the needs in the classroom, which might include co-teaching, it might include additional adult support through collaboration, push-in related services, and instructional coaches who are trained experts in different areas, depending upon some of the various levels of needs in the classroom. And then lastly, next year, we'll be adding a family interventionist to help support students that are struggling to attend school. Mostly that's been exacerbated by COVID, but also just in general, where school refusal or anxiety around socialization or social skills, it's even more heightened. And so we'll be able to work directly in the home and help support an action plan or a positive support plan to get students back into school in the least restrictive environment. And so, because of all the work of our department, the teachers and our related service providers and administrators, we're now at 12%, which is aligned to the state average. And it's really a testament to the work that the teams have done to make sure that kids' needs can be met in the general education classroom.
Great, thank you. And before we move on to thinking about placement and inclusion, I want to talk a little bit more about one specific piece of determining eligibility. One of the things teams are supposed to consider, that they need to consider, specifically for students who are suspected of having learning disabilities, is looking at, are the students' learning difficulties related to cultural factors or environmental or economic disadvantage? And for any of the disabilities, looking, to see, is it related to not getting adequate instruction in reading and math, or is it related to being an English language learner? And I think sometimes those are hard conversations for IEP teams to have. They kind of rush through that and check the boxes and say, nope, those aren't the reasons, because those are hard things to talk about. In your districts, are you guys seeing people kind of dig in and have those conversations? And how do you train teams to be able to think really critically about those questions to make sure, we're putting the kids in special education who need that support, and for other kids, we're finding the support that they need, which might be something different. Cheryl, do you want to jump in on this?
Sure. Some of those conversations actually happen at the MTSS level. When we're talking about putting interventions in place, we're looking at student attendance. We're looking at those other supports that students need, and are they getting them? Are we providing those supports with fidelity? So we do start early in having those conversations. Because we have preschool, we also have to look at, is it an opportunity gap or is it a deficit when we're thinking about identifying students, right? Because when we talked about poverty earlier, we know that, we talk about the word gaps that occur and those experience gaps that happen. So definitely we do have those conversations early, and we do process that at the IEP meeting when we look at those exclusionary factors.
Jenny, do you have thoughts on this one?
The only thing that I would add is I think this is always complicated for teams. I think you really need to have those experts at the table. And I appreciate that Cheryl said it really starts before the eligibility meeting, because it always does, right? It's definitely part of your domain process. You're even before that, your pre-referral, your MTSS process, and really using the expertise of your staff and making sure that they are trained. We've spent a lot of time partnering with Forensic on providing training on special education laws and practices, and what are some of the things that we should be thinking about when we're asking those questions, because they're really important to make sure students of color are not disproportionately identified for special education. And so looking at, as Cheryl said, the academic record, really talking to the feeder school. So for us, oftentimes it's like knowing about the history, what was their attendance during middle school or elementary? Did they miss a lot of school? We are fortunate to have two related service providers who have the bilingual endorsement, and they both speak Spanish. And although obviously that doesn't meet all the needs of all of our learners who may need a bilingual evaluation, they can provide some expertise, not just around Spanish, but just around language acquisition, culturally relevant assessments, methods for teaching bilingual students. We also have an instructional coach now that helps support with our EL learner needs and making sure in the classroom we have the right visuals when we're pairing language, their native language with English, and really having those ongoing conversations to making sure that we're not saying that they have a disability when really they can perform commensurate to their peers in their own language. And so it's definitely an important conversation.
Great, thank you. Well, so let's turn to placement and inclusion now. And what potential causes you may have seen there, and steps your districts are taking to address that. I don't know, Cheryl or Jeremy, if you want to start with any observations or things you've identified there.
Our conversations when we come to placement is always that it's not about a place, it's about services. We look at where we can best provide the services that the student needs that aligns with the IEP goals. We definitely start our conversations with looking at the least restrictive environment first. And in doing that, we've also had the opportunity to collapse some of our self-contained environments, and are definitely pushing more towards inclusion. And we've been on a trend the last 4 years and making sure that students are in the least restrictive environment. We're not moving as fast as we would like to. So we know we need to speed it up a bit, but that's going to take some work. But definitely, those are how we make decisions. Is where can we best support the students when we're talking about least restrictive environment? What supports does that student need to be successful in this environment is one of the questions that we asked so that we can process that together.
One thing that I would add right here is I think this is a critical area, as Jenny just mentioned, as it relates to training. I think this also really is a great place for us to think about training for our staff as well, because if our staff really understand placement, understand the options, what really drives that placement, which are the services, it really helps them to better understand the array of options that we are looking at. But it also, as we think about moving towards a more inclusion-based model, it really helps us understand how we can truly include students and still meet their needs. But I think a lot of that comes from training, both from the outside, from folks like me who are lawyers and can talk about the law and the regulations, but also from folks who are the content experts on special education. And so I just wanted to reiterate that because I think it's an important point.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. Jenny, anything to add?
Yes, so we've been partnering the last 2 years with 2 content area experts, one on inclusive practices and one on UDL and differentiation. And I think that that has really been a pivotal point for us where we've really started to make some major shifts in the way that we think about servicing our students. And so what Cheryl said about location really rings true to me, and placement. And one of our consultants, she sort of revised the definition of inclusion and said you can't have inclusion without place, that it has to be one of the major prongs. And so you have to have placement in the gen ed setting in order to have, full inclusion. And so it's really made me think differently, like Jeremy said, and a lot of the questions that we ask our teams, because oftentimes when we're overwhelmed by whether a student's struggling academically or social emotionally, we equate that to a service when really it is about thinking about the needs and then what else can we do or try, and really not giving up until we find something. And all of the inclusion professional development I've participated in the last 3 years always say there's not a one way, and every student is different and unique, and you might try something that doesn't work. That doesn't mean take them out of the inclusive setting. That means try something else, try something new, try something different. And so it's a lot of conversations around that. And I think it also stems from pre-service training. And so really partnering with our colleges and universities, making sure that they're actually providing the correct research around what it means to meet all students' needs, because a lot of people think that because of LRE that means that we can place someone in a more restrictive setting. And yes, we can, but only after we've exhausted, all the other LREs before that. And so some of the areas that we've really focused on is looking at our students with the most significant support needs, spending more time in the general education setting. They were spending a lot of time in what we all know is EE code 3. So the bulk of their day in special education, regardless of race, mostly because of their eligibility category. And again, equating that eligibility to a specific level of need requires a certain number service, in a specific classroom. We've also considered and examined our number of students outplaced and what supports were we missing in order to be able to meet our students' needs within the classroom. And I think a lot of that also comes from, special education training, including my own as a former self-contained teacher. A smaller setting is better for kids. I can provide more one-to-one attention. I can be available to catch everything or support that student to not fall through the cracks. When in reality, we're really enabling them and not fostering that independence that they need to be successful, and teaching them the skills and having the models from their peers that they often really benefit from, and all that the research supports as well. And the last area that I just wanted to briefly talk about, because I think it's pretty cool, is that we started really looking at cohorts of students over 3 years and their trajectory. And so this last year, we specifically looked at our Hispanic students, and we wanted to look at their experiences here at Lake Forest High School and making sure that they're meeting and exceeding standards just like their peers. And although they're not quite there yet, every year in the last 3 years, because of some of these changes we've made, they've consistently grown in attendance, involvement in extracurricular activities, grades and GPA, and are spending more time in the general education setting. So although we still have a lot of work to do, I think we're on the right trajectory.
Can I jump in with one extra thought on this? And I think you guys, what you're saying really echoes exactly what's in the law. We need to try everything we can in the gen ed environment before we remove a student from that environment. And Jeremy and you guys have all talked about training for your staff about how do you build their skills and capacity to differentiate and be able to include students. Have you done any work with your families? I think families sometimes have this perception that, well, my student needs a lot of support, so they really need a self-contained setting or a therapeutic day school or a smaller class or pull out so they get that individualized attention, and helping parents understand the benefits of a student being included in the general ed environment. You guys run into that at all or done any work with it?
So we have a community liaison in our district who works actually with special education. So he is the person that kind of sends out all the information that comes in for programming around for different organizations and groups that parents can be a part of. So he and our outplacement coordinator presented an idea to our director to do parent videos. So we've actually done one parent video and we're preparing to do another parent video. So just really providing that information to parents, like, what is your role in the IEP process? We also share a lot with our parents that are coming in through EI that are transitioning. The state has something that when I'm 3, where will I be? So it really starts preparing parents and helping them understand that process, like we're moving from early intervention to what school is like. The gentleman that I talked about that is our communication liaison is actually going to be bringing back some of our parent support groups in the fall. We also have worked very closely with our outreach department, and we also have another department called FACE, which really works with families. So we're really looking also at what do we have going on in our district and how can we work together to support families and providing the information. And also, it is difficult sometimes for families when students have been in those self-contained environments for such a long time to like, ooh, you know what, I'm afraid. Right? And so it's up to us to support them and helping them understand that that can be a benefit to their students. We're also working with some other preschool organizations in the state to work towards building staff capacity, as you stated. And because I'm an early childhood person, although I work in a K-12 district, I still do all K-12. But we know that early start is so important. And it's so family focused, that 3 to 5, right? Families are in everything. We do so many parent activities with families and we have parent educators. So we do want to continue working towards moving that on up in the school district and supporting families and just really understanding and making decisions for what's in the best interest of their children.
Thanks, Cheryl. So, let's briefly still hear, from each of you too, with regard to discipline. So what have been your observations there and some steps you're taking, to address what you're seeing there? Cheryl or Jeremy, do you want to talk about Waukegan?
Go ahead, Cheryl.
Of course, wouldn't you know that my I can't scroll to my notes. So one of the things that I shared earlier is that we do have some behavior interventionists that are supporting schools. We are focusing on restorative justice. We also, MTSS is very involved in this, as well as our social workers being involved in this. Really looking at the restorative practice. So our equity department comes in and works with that. So definitely, in regards to that, we also have a student representative on our school board. And I really like that piece of it because he brings the student voice out. He talks to the students and he's able to bring those voices out. So we do listen to the students also. We do utilize some data in our district. We use the panorama data. So we look at teacher do a survey, but also students do a survey. So with that information, we're kind of able to identify some of the areas where students may feel that they're not being supported, that may impact how they behave, or the choices they make. We also want to make sure that families are informed of our discipline policy. So we do actually have a parent group that looks through that information, that also is supported by some school board members and other community members and staff members. So really in that sense, as we look at discipline, we want to support students in making the best decisions, but we also need to support our administration and utilizing restorative justice practices rather than the one, the 3 strikes you're out. We need to give students some grace, and we also need to utilize some of those PBIS strategies with teaching the appropriate behaviors, but also allowing students to practice those behaviors. And I think that as we continue moving along with those practices, we will see that indicator for data change for us.
Great. Jenny, do you want to share about your district?
Sure, I can be very brief since I know we're wrapping up here. We don't really have major discipline issues. When we really look at our discipline data, we have less than 5 out of school suspensions and really less than probably 10 in school suspensions. And our dean's office, as well as partnering with our core team, so our school psychs, our social workers, our counselors, our MTSS coordinators, they've really developed a proactive and responsive approach. That doesn't mean we don't have behaviors, we just don't really use suspension anymore for any types of behaviors. It's really a restorative approach. And I think one of the things is we really try to think of the student or the child's whole experience. And we don't want them to be defined by making mistakes. We want them to learn from it. And so it's really a teachable moment. So working with that core team to identify how are they going to either repair the relationship or maybe engage in some work around learning in that area. And really for all offenses, cutting class, inappropriate comments, vaping, fighting, drugs and alcohol, we do not suspend kids for those things unless it's like a multiple offense thing. And we've tried everything. And so we partner with our SAP coordinator for drug and alcohol offenses as well. Similar to what Cheryl talked about, really teaching skills. So whether that's counseling, whether that's being in some of our multi-tiered system groups and focusing on social skills, decision-making, shared responsibility. But our goal is for students not to miss class. We don't want them to fall further behind in their core academics. And we really save out of school suspension for the last resort, those serious behaviors that are threatening to others or involve, potentially weapons or something.
Jenny, we had a question in our Q&A for you to repeat the resource that you mentioned that I think was specific to addressing the root causes of disparities. I think it was specific to discipline.
Yeah, so it's from the Safe Supportive Learning. It's called Addressing the Root Causes of Disparities in School Discipline. It's from July of 2015. I can show you what it looks like if you can kind of see that. When you can Google it, it's on Google, but we could probably also share it out too when we share out the presentation, I'm guessing.
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Jenny. So Jeremy, I know we're getting close to wrapping up here, but would you be able to just tell us a bit more about the compliance or potential liability issues that you think about related to these issues that those who are listening should be aware of?
Yeah, I can share a few things briefly. So from the compliance perspective, I don't know that my special education administrative team would agree, but I think there truly has been a lot of great work and effort put into looking at our data, continuing to think about and how we improve our practices as it relates to some of the ISB findings that we've encountered. And so while it's not a fun process, I think it's one that is both necessary but also beneficial, because that is truly how we begin to make a strong impact on behalf of our students. And so as much as it's not fun, I think it's still a great opportunity to really build for our students. With that said, as I think about these issues from a legal perspective, there are a few things that come to mind. One, as Kendra mentioned earlier, there are some issues related to funding that can play a role in all of this. So if you are cited for disproportionality, you are required to dedicate 15% of your IDEA flow-through funds to related factors. So that's certainly something that we are constantly thinking about. And there's always a question of how do you spend that and where can we make the most impact? But that's certainly one thing that we're thinking about. In my role, because I do represent the district in special education litigation, we are seeing from time to time due process requests related to identification of students for special education and also around student discipline related issues. And so if we are looking at suspending or expelling a student, are we making sure that we're complying with all the requirements? Have we stopped to have that MDR meeting? And are we making the right choice for our students? Those are all things that we have to be looking at and take the time to really address in that process. Beyond that, I think we're really looking at a couple things within the district. I think there's generally, at least in Waukegan, some community concerns and also just a general community perception that we have to be aware of and think about, because there's a lot that comes along with being cited for disproportionality, especially over the course of 3 years. We're certainly working to make improvements and make changes, but the community is concerned. And so we have to be aware of that, but we also have to be very transparent in dealing with that and educating the community about the things that we are doing so that we can make a positive impact and change those numbers so that we're not continued to be cited. And beyond that, I think that, and it goes without saying, we've talked about a lot of this already, but I think on an ongoing basis, we really have to focus on engaging our stakeholders and also including our Board of Education. They need to know and understand what this is all about and why it's important and how we can improve it. And then really thinking about getting community buy-in so that we have their support, continuing to monitor and improve our practices in general, and continuing to provide training. I think those are crucial issues as we move forward and really focus in on how to address that issue. So I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are all good things to keep in mind for sure. As we wrap up, maybe you can each give us a little bit of, how do your equity issues related to special education fit into the broader equity work that your districts are doing, and kind of give us a little bit of a bigger picture as we conclude here. Who wants to start?
I can give a brief overview. So, in Waukegan, we are certainly looking at this both from the broad level, but also in from a narrow perspective as well as it relates to special education. But as Dr. Caesar mentioned previously, we have hired a director of equity and inclusion for the district. We have a newly created department around those issues as well. But I think at the end of the day, what we're really focused on, that department just recently did an equity assessment, and this is data that's out there that we published. But our district, we have roughly 12% of our students being African American, but they make up over 30% of our overall suspensions within the district. And that's a high number. And I think we have to know that, we have to understand that. And now begins the task of doing the work and putting specific plans in place so that we can address that not only for all of our students, but also for our students with disabilities who fall into those numbers.
I can go next. I think the key takeaway for me is that every district kind of starts in a different place. And we really started our inclusion and equity work centered around students with disabilities and making sure, I had sort of referenced this before, but looking at those 4 tenets of inclusion. So like place in the general education setting, membership, participation and engagement, and finally learning. And now next year, we'll be really expanding that lens to include multiple identities. So really looking at race and gender and religion and ethnicity, because you really, my favorite quote is, you really can't have equity without inclusion, and you can't have inclusion without equity. And I think they go hand in hand. And so I think anywhere you start is a good starting place, but you have to continue to work until we're really creating a better place for all students and staff. It's about everyone feeling a sense of belonging and membership. We also have, like I said earlier, we're partnering with these outside consultants that have really helped us take a holistic approach in examining our overall student experience. And so when we think about our students, we want them to be supported and challenged, academically, social, emotionally, and have outside experiences outside the classroom extracurricularly too, that are inclusive and that feel good. And so we've recently formed an equity and inclusion committee this year that will expand next year to include increased stakeholders and really expand our view beyond special education. And so I'm really looking forward to that continued work in our district as well.
I think that when we start looking at how closely equity is related to access, that every child isn't going to get the same thing, but they're going to get what they need. And really looking at children individually, that's what the IEP says that we are supposed to be doing anyway. So I think as we work through that for all children, we will do a better job of providing a more equitable learning environment for students to be successful.
Great. Well, thank you to each of you again for joining us today. We are so grateful to Dr. Sterpin, Dr. Caesar, and Mr. Duffy for sharing your experiences and insights with us. If listeners have questions or want to discuss how to tackle this work as an administrator and district, you can reach out directly to Jenny and Cheryl and Jeremy, who are happy to continue the discussion. If you have any legal questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to any of our attorneys at Franzik. We know this work is a process and we want to make this an ongoing conversation. So please do reach out and let us know if you have questions or topics that you think we should address during our series, or if your district is doing good work that you want to highlight. You can also share this session with your colleagues. The recording will be available on the Franzik website, as well as on our Education Law Insights podcast. Please do join us again on July 8th for our next equity webinar, which will focus, as Kendra said, on student discipline. So thank you again for being part of this effort and for the work that all of you are doing to educate all of our students. Thank you again and have a great afternoon.